Ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Hi, this is Christopher, and today we're going to be talking about Solfa. In my recent interview with Shelle Soelberg, we talked about two tools she discovered which transformed the way she related to music and gave her much more freedom and confidence. One of those was Solfa, also known as solfege or solfeggio. If you've listened to a few episodes of this podcast, you probably already know that I discovered quite late in my own musical life that there was something you can do called ear training that lets you actually recognize and understand the notes you hear in music. Solfa was an even later discovery for me, and I totally wish I had learned it from the outset, the way they teach in Shelle's Let's Play Music system. So I wanted to do this episode not to try and teach you Solfa, that would be too much to try and cram in, but to simply say to you what I wish someone had said to me early on, which is what Solfa is and what it can do for you as a musician. So let's dive in. First things first, what is Solfa? Simply put, Solfa is a system for naming each note of the major scale. You can apply Solfa to minor scales and every chromatic note too, but at its core, Solfa means you give each note in the major scale a short name: do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and do again. There is a system called fixed do solfege, which is popular in France, for example, where these names correspond directly to the letter names in music, so that the note C is always do, for example. To put it bluntly, that's really not very helpful. It doesn't add anything to the C, D, E naming that we already have. So that is not the kind of Solfa we're talking about. What is helpful is the system called moveable do. When people say Solfa rather than solfege or solfeggio, they normally mean moveable do. And in this system, do is always the bottom note of the scale, the tonic or root note, and that's true whatever key you're in. That's what gives Solfa its power. You've probably heard of this do-re-mi system, and you might have thought it was just for kids or it was something obscure and theoretical. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is, in my opinion, the fastest way to get an instinctive and useful understanding of music by ear. So why is Solfa so powerful? The core thing to understand is that this moveable do Solfa system mirrors how we actually create and interpret music. When you listen to a song, you recognize the melody and you experience the harmony based on the relative pitch distances between notes. It doesn't much matter to you whether the song is in the key of C or in the key of E flat. If you take a pop song and you transpose it to another key, every note changes, but we still hear and recognize the same song when it's played in the new key. Solfa matches that relative interpreting of notes because we're always thinking in terms of how notes fit into the scale and relate to the tonic of the key. That means that every bit of practice you do learning Solfa can be immediately applied in any key and used for any music you hear. Now, I want to talk for a moment about Solfa and intervals. You might have come across interval recognition as another way to get this understanding of relative pitch. Intervals are super useful, and they are also powerful. In fact, they're the way that I started out with ear training, and in certain situations, they are still what I would recommend a musician to learn with. But the trouble with intervals is that even once you master recognizing each type of interval, it's a whole other thing to learn to apply them to real musical tasks, and to do it fast enough to be useful to you in your musical life. Solfa, on the other hand, is useful from day one. I think we'll have to do a whole other episode on the pros and cons of Solfa versus interval recognition, but to give you one simple example of what I'm talking about. Supposing you hear a melody that goes bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 bum. If I wanted to play that by ear or write down the notes using interval recognition, I would have to carefully think through each pair of notes and the interval between them. Bum, bum, minor third, bum, 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 major second, bum, 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 major second, and so on. And then I'd also need to think through translating those intervals to particular note names in a particular key. That's doable, but it takes quite some time to get fast with it, even once you're good at recognizing individual intervals. With solfa, on the other hand, my brain immediately recognizes the patterns there and interprets it instinctively as so, mi, re, do, sol, la, do. And once I've done that, I can immediately write it down or play it in any key. In C major, for example, I would know that corresponds to G, E, D, C, G, A, C. Job done. So that's one quick example of how solfa compares to interval recognition for doing things like playing melodies by ear or transcribing music. Now, as I said, there are definitely advantages to interval recognition too, and we'll talk about them on another episode in future. So what else can solfa be used for? Well, we had a great example recently inside Musical U, where our monthly topic in our instrument packs was scale degree recognition, which is essentially solfa, though you might choose to call the scale degrees 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, instead of do, re, mi. Each of our resident pros had a different and interesting angle on the usefulness of this skill. In our resource pack for guitar, Dylan Welsh explained how you can use the different chords in the key to spot different scale degrees, and also a clever way to think about the non-chord notes in terms of their scale degree. In the pack for piano, Sarah Campbell talked about using solfa to play melodies by ear, even if they go beyond the major scale. In our bass pack, Steve Lawson applied it to chord progressions and bass lines, whether you want to play them by ear or improvise your own lines. And in the singing pack, Claire Wheeler discussed solfa for sight-singing music you haven't seen before, finding your starting note when it isn't given to you directly, and how you can use scale degrees for vocal improvisation. So solfa is something you can use to play melodies and chords by ear, to sight-sing music, to improvise, and to write your own music. It's a beautiful system because it so closely relates to how we actually hear music. That's what makes it so fast to learn and so immediately useful. Solfa is a big focus for us at Musical U for these reasons, and if you want to learn more, I'm going to put some links in the show notes to help you take the next step. And of course, if you want full training in this powerful skill, we do have our special offer for podcast listeners to join Musical U and get access to all our training modules, including some fantastic ones for learning solfa quickly. You can find that at musicalitypodcast.com/join. So that's it for this quick intro to the power of solfa. I really wish someone had sat me down early on in my music learning and introduced me to this system. So I hope that this brief introduction inspires you to take a closer look at solfa and take advantage of it in your own musical life.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners. That's musicalitypodcast.com.
Hey there, Christopher again. Just a quick word before you take off. This podcast is brand new, and I have 2 things to ask you. Number 1, if you're enjoying the show, please go to iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, subscribe to the show, and then rate and review it. This would mean a huge amount to me, and it really helps us get the show out there in front of more people, and that means helping more musicians just like you. The second thing is, I want your feedback. What do you think of the show? If there are things you love, hate, or would like to see us add, if there are guests you think we should interview, or if you have a burning question about musicality that you'd like us to answer on the show, please shoot me an email. It's hello@musicalitypodcast.com. Thanks so much for listening and for subscribing, rating, and reviewing the show. And thanks for giving your feedback to help us make the podcast the best